It's my pleasure to introduce our next presenter, Brian Cochran. And Brian is Washington Conservation Commission employee down in Denver at a water quality monitoring system conference. So Brian, we hope all the technology works and that you can take control now of the slides. So Brian Cochran on Washington's Conservation Practice Data System. Brian?
I do have it, too much. So I've got a lot to cover here. This is about our Conservation Practice Data System that we've had in place since about 2000. And I really want to talk more about the changes and updates we recently went through than the system itself. And so, come on, delay. All right, so you can't redesign a system or climb mountains without a team. So I want to make sure I thank my team. Courtney and Melissa are part of our finance team. Mark Clark was our former executive director, very supportive. And then our system is built by Encon Information Systems, and they've been extremely patient with us as we worked through this because it was a fairly major overhaul. And as I was thinking about this presentation today, I was trying to figure out what was it that got us into the original system and caused some of the needs for update that we saw. So I'm hopefully going to give you an overview of Washington, the old system, and some of the design thinking that we went through, and then some of the challenges that we've met along the way. That's a lot in 10 minutes. So part of our issue is that Washington is extremely variable, from above 180 inches in the Olympic Peninsula and precip to 6 in the central part of the state. If we layer geography on top of that, we've got another layer of complexity in a relatively small area. If we add, that then drives the kind of agriculture. So we really needed a flexible system when we first built our system in the 2000 vintage, because the types of ag then drive the types of BMPs. We also have some really varied natural resource issues in the state, from typical farmland sediment issues in the Palouse. This is Palouse Falls and the Palouse River, which generate about a third of the sediment in the Snake River system. Salmon are kind of sensitive to sediment. Salmon's a big deal in the Snake River and the Columbia system. We also have a lot of rangelands, sage grouse, narrowly avoided a listing. Just examples of some of the resource concerns we have. And then there's the whole urban Puget Sound with its own set of issues with urbanization. And most of you probably tracked some of the issues with orca last summer with one of our moms carrying a calf for a bunch of weeks. So Ray, how'd I do? 2 examples from Eastern Washington, only 1 from Western. The original CPDS, when you add all of these different kinds of agricultures and different kinds of natural resources and exponentially generate that times 45 conservation districts, which is the E to the 45, we really needed a flexible system in our original build. So we designed that. This is the level of workload that we saw. The original thinking in the original system was that the primary unit was a project, much like you've heard others today, and the secondary unit was practices, BMPs. Very little drop downs, a lot of free text, which is good for flexibility. Very little dependencies between related types of fields like status and funding dates. And a very programmatic focus because it was generated based on the needs of the Conservation Commission. And so we finally started that. I think that should be 1998. My mistake. Come on, advance, please. Advance, please. I lost my advance. Ray, I'm going to have to hand back to you, I think.
All right, got it. Okay, there you go. And back to you.
I need the next one. Oh, back to me? Okay. So part of what we were facing for the need for a major update was that the technology, we were a cloud-based system in the 2000s. Some of you will remember that cloud technology was different then. These were some of the engines and browsers, and the way the technology is transferred between the user and the server is much different now. That was causing us a lot of headaches in terms of keeping the system up to date with the internet standards and how data is exchanged. One of my first assignments when I came on in 2014 was to write a report on the CREP projects and how many riparian forest buffers had been installed. So we have a fairly robust report writer even in the old system. So I said, well, how much, what kinds of things do I have under practice name includes riparian? And this is the list I got on the right for all the different kinds of riparian forest buffer that were in the system under practice name. I said, well, that's not exactly helpful on the reporting side. In addition, we had a number of projects with blank practice names, and if I did includes RIP, you can imagine I got all the misspellings of riparian. So we had some data quality issues because of the free text entry. We had a field called practice type, which seemed to be more closely linked to a NRCS code number. I said, well, what about that one? So I queried that for riparian forest buffer, and I got a mess, quite frankly, and really weird units. And so we had some real data quality issues going on in addition to the technology. And the workflow, again, like I said, was a very mission-oriented workflow. And so one of the things we did as we entered the process was to have a conversation with our CD users. And what we heard was, this system doesn't make sense for how I do my work. My day-to-day workflow is different from the workflow the system wants. So as we talked with them, we found out that the CDs, the technicians entering the data, are talking to a producer who owns or manages a piece of ground, for lack of a better word, a property. NRCS calls this a management unit. That property has resource concerns that need to be addressed, or natural resource issues that then need BMPs as a prescription to fix, that then need money to pay for. And so our field users were working with one workflow, and as we thought about it, the beauty was the commission was actually working with a backwards workflow from what they were doing. So it's complicated, but it's simple because we actually are working with the same workflow just from different ends. The commission has money to pay for certain BMPs that address certain resource concerns, and you can get the idea from there. So two workflows isn't bad. And so the new system actually reflects those two workflows. So in the upper left, I tried to explode things because the screenshot is so small. You see two icons, one says landowners BMPs and one says programs. That reflects the two ways of approaching the data from the two user groups. And then if you come into the landowner BMP side, the tabs work their way sequentially across the top, starting with the landowner. You can see I've highlighted the landowner tab. The next issue, if you complete the landowner information, I noticed some others had red stars in theirs. We now have red stars in ours. That mean required fields. You must complete the landowner required fields before it'll let you enter the property fields and move down the workflow. So we did create some lat-long dependencies, like I saw in Martin's presentation. We didn't have those before. Those required manual entry by users, and so guess what? If they didn't need to fill them out, they were blank. So we now have the GIS doing some of the heavy lifting. The resource concerns was a nice piece because I don't think we had conservation practice physical effects in place in the early 2000s. So we've incorporated that into the new system, mainly as a way of decreasing the drop-down list to select the practices that the technicians want funded, but it also helps us identify what things out there in the world are being fixed. So we can tell a story about, we spent this much money on these kinds of BMPs to fix these kinds of resource concerns. So it really helps us with that accountability piece and tell the good story about the work that CDs do. The BMP tab is the next thing that you get to. We use the lat-long indicator for the property to then open the map field to where on the property is this BMP, because some of our Eastern Washington properties can be many sections in size, and so the street address or the address of the property wasn't going to get us there. So we've done some tools to make life easier for the users. We've done some automatic things in the background. So if you selected resource concerns in CPPE, the only BMPs in your available drop-down list will be those that scored a positive score on the conservation practice physical effects matrix. From that, the NRCS code automatically populates, whether an engineer is needed or not, it automatically populates, the design life automatically propagates. And so we saved a lot of data entry on the part of the users by making a lot of dependencies. And then finally, you come to the funding tab, which you can track the different sources of funding. And in this case, one of the issues I had in the old system was the status tab was independent of everything else in the system. So if we approve funding for commission funds, the status tab is automatically reflected as funded. When we close out a project, we have a closeout tab further down the workflow. When we hit closeout, the status automatically transfers to completed. So we've made it a lot more user-friendly. We make sure that related actions reflect each other. Come on, change. There we go. So then the piece is, there are certain programs that we need a little more about, CREP being one. So if you select CREP funding, you need to also select the CREP type, and that's dependent on the BMP content. So if you selected riparian forest buffer, which is a primary CREP BMP, you then can generate information about that program type. So what is it about this? The programmatic piece kind of comes in towards the end. And so here's all my CREP information for this particular project. And then, so let's talk about some of the challenges. So in the drop-down list, we went strictly with NRCS practice names or SCC approved practices, which we developed our own resource concerns, positive, minus, plus, minus for. And so what we found from early use in the system, the new system, is that people say, I can't find my BMP name, my favorite BMP. Well, you need to understand NRCS. A couple reasons that could be, and let me talk about some of those. It's not a positive CPPE score. We don't want to be paying for BMPs that don't have a positive effect on the landscape. And we really don't want to be paying for BMPs that have a negative impact. So you can see I've highlighted the negative scores in red and the positive scores in green. We wouldn't want to fund a waste transfer BMP on a property that has soil erosion, sheet and rill erosion issues because it's a negative effect. So we wanted to limit the displayed list of available BMPs depending on what had been selected in the resource concerns. Come on, change. Go, baby. Go, baby. Go, baby. Is that me dinging in your background, Ray?
Yes.
There we go. Whoops. Okay. So the other reason is that we might have a problem is what I call funny names. NRCS has their own language. And I'm trying to get this to go back up. In our state, anadromous fisheries are an important consideration. Culverts, like the picture on the left there, they can't migrate up, so we change them. In general, most of us call that culvert replacement. NRCS in their language, and no diss on them, they've had a long history of success, calls it aquatic organism passage. And if you read the description, it's the modification or removal of barriers that impede aquatic organisms. So you have to learn the right name. And we had a lot of, everybody calls things different names. In the stormwater world, which is part of my background, these are called rain barrels. If this thing will advance, come on. If you look in the list of practice definitions in CPPE, you find something that says a facility for collecting and storing runoff, and that is called a water harvesting catchment. So getting my folks that are working in the stormwater world to think NRCS so that we're calling the same practice the same name so that when we go to query it, we get a complete picture. So the other reason that you might not see your BMP is that, and this is a Ray term, junk drawers, and what I call umbrella practices. Some NRCS practices are actually a level above an actual practice. So if you look at nutrient management 590, you read the technical documentation on 590, it will tell you that there are more specific practices that are going on the ground. And we saw some of that in the previous note about the primary and then the practice details. This is how we addressed it. We strictly got rid of, or initially we got rid of them, we had a lot of pushback. We've now made it so that you can select these broader practices, but you'll get a note that SCC doesn't pay for them because we want to know exactly what's happening on the ground. And that way we have more accountability for our money. So as we've gone through this process, some of the wins we've seen, we're hearing that the users really like the workflow. It's intuitive for them. It makes sense. We get complete data as we go through. The automated data entry reduces their effort. As we report out, we get really consistent data. We've done some limited error trapping to get rid of the obvious stuff. For example, If you go to enter a lat long physically, if you forget your minus sign because our longitude is -120, if you forget our minus sign, it's going to say that's in Russia, and we really want you to pick a spot inside your CD. And so we've done some of that to help users get the right pieces in the right place. We have forced a conversation that I think we needed about what we call practices, especially between, as I mentioned, the silos between farm planning and stormwatering. And it's really forcing us to clean up our old data, which was inherited from some of the data that we actually seeded the original system with. So we started with version 1 of this process in May of 2018. We completed that. We had to give up some things because every project has bugaboos. And version 1.5, we've just completed this year, adding back some pieces to get us to where we wanted to be after the first change. We're now in the data cleanup mode. And I think once we get to that, we'll be in really good shape as far as a good system for both the users and for the commission. Future enhancements, we do actually keep a separate finance database that talks to the state auditor's office, and that's our official record, so we want to look at integrating that. Our report writer is already really strong. We'd like to work on that. We'd like to think about automated reminders so that if there's all of our projects have an annual requirement for the CDs to certify the practice is still installed. Based on the closeout date, we could actually then generate a time system that would send an email reminder to you in 1 year, so that folks can keep track of their monitoring that they need to do. CREP has mid-contract management that would be really handy. Depending on when your year start of your contract date, we could have an email sent to the technician to say, hey, you're in the mid-management contract date range for this project. I was really happy to see Ohio looking at outreach as events. The thing that's exciting for us about that is that if we have that, except for the school kids, the outcome of the events be a list of names. The names is then the entry point to our current workflow. So in theory, we could track the participation of a provider at certain kinds of outreach events all the way through to the types of BMPs and the kinds of funding that they participated in, which is really exciting to be able to provide that feedback on effectiveness of outreach. So we're really excited by that. And while we're now able to display point data by web, we really want to be able to roll things up in a public-facing web interface, say by watershed, and kind of create a dashboard of what kinds of work is going on where in a broad sense. And that's all I've got, Ray.